About a few weeks ago, Benny announced that the theme for the Photoshop battle for February was going to be movie/TV characters. And this was the image that he had provided, and I looked at it and I wondered what could I turn him into. At first I thought I should turn him into the Terminator, but then I was like, nah, I've done something similar recently. And so I thought I should turn him into Jack Sparrow. Captain Jack Sparrow. But that kind of fell through when I couldn't quite imagine a good concept in my head. But then it clicked one day. I've been gearing up for an anime transformation on my channel for quite some time now. So I thought to myself, why not take this opportunity to turn Benny into an anime character? And of all characters, why not turn Benny into Goku? Alright, so to begin with, here we got the original image that Benny provided, and now I'm gonna make this invisible so that we have this nice black background. And as I scroll down here, you can see that I color coded most of the groups, and there are a bunch of layers in these groups, but don't worry about it right now. So the first thing that we're gonna do is that I'm gonna go all the way down here to the sky, which is color coded as purple. So I'm gonna come here and open this group. And the first thing that I did here is that I filled this space with this color, a shade of blue, I guess. And the reason why I did this is because right on top of that, I added a stock image of this sky, and I reduced its opacity to about 90%. So as you can see, when I reduce its opacity, you can see that a little bit of blue tint kind of coming through the stock image. So that was the whole purpose of it. And there are a few layers over here which is not really important right now because I'll be coming back to them later on. So we are done with the sky. And after that, I added an exposure layer on top of it, and I increased the exposure just a little bit, which made the sky brighter. And as you can see, I increased the exposure to about 0.28. Alrighty then, so now moving on to the next part, which is the ground, which is color coded in green. And for the ground, I used this stock image, and then I resized it, and then I positioned it into place, after which I added an exposure layer on top. And then I reduced its exposure, after which I also added a color balance layer on top. And then I moved some of the sliders to bring in some cyan color as well as blue color so that it matched with the rest of the environment. And right behind it, I added some shapes in the shape of mountains, and I added some fog as well, just to add some depth of field and to get that atmospheric look. So that is pretty much what I did here in this group. Alright, so now that we're done with the background, let's move on to the main subject, which is obviously Benny. So before that, let me bring back Benny for reference. And this next step was the most difficult part of the edit, which was adding the clothing. So I'm gonna add the upper clothes as well as the lower clothes here. And for the clothing, I used only two stock images, which was this stock image as well as this stock image. And as you can see, if I zoom right in, so for the upper clothes, especially for the orange section of the uniform, I used this stock image, and for the dark blue clothing item underneath the orange, I used this stock image, specifically this section of this stock image. And even with the lower clothing, it was mostly crafted through cutting out and warping bits and pieces from these two images. So basically, hold on, let me show you something. So if I add one more layer, the layer count comes to 246, and you might be asking like, why so many layers, right? So basically, with the upper clothes as well as the lower clothes, I had to do a lot of patchwork, had to do a lot of covering up, and that's why the layer count is that high. And with the shadows and highlights, I'll be coming back to them later on. I would say that the clothing was the most difficult part, in the sense that it was the most time consuming part of this edit. And after that, I added more parts of the clothing one by one. So first I added the belt, which was also created by using this region of this stock image. And then I also added the sleeves, which is like this small section over here in this region. Alright, so let's move on to the next step. And as you can see here in this reference image, there is this portion of his hoodie that's kind of extending out, but we don't want that. We obviously want it to be in this shape, and yet I don't want to get rid of the reference either. So basically what I did here in this layer, which I named the base layer, is that I removed these two parts. So it's basically the same image, but with these two portions gone. Alright, so moving on to the next step, which was adding the arms. And here I actually had two choices. I could have used Benny's arms, which I could have in some way managed to extend it to his shoulders. And I could have somehow covered up the portion of the hoodie, as that was the look that I was going for. So I could have done that, but I took the easier option, which was introducing a different pair of arms. And this is the stock image that I used for it. So if I make this visible, you can see that the two arms are actually the same. So I used this guy's left arm and I flipped it horizontally for the other arm as well. And then I erased some portions from both to reveal the original image. So technically the arms are a blend between two different images. Alright, so let me show you what I mean by that. So let me open this group right here and you can see plenty of layers over here. Just ignore that at the moment because those are shadows and highlights which we will be talking about later on. So I'm gonna come here and open this group as well. So I have two layer masks that are disabled here. So I'm gonna click on it and it'll go back to its original state. And you can see the color of the arm change because obviously, like I said, it is a blend of two images. Right, so that's what this is, and I know it looks a bit off right now, but when all the lighting, the highlights, shadows, when everything comes together, it will look nice. So that's basically what I did here with the arms. Alright then, so moving on to the next step, which is changing the neck region. So what we want to do here is get rid of this portion of the hoodie, and we want to extend the neck or this portion till here. So basically for that, what I did here is that I used this image and I cut out a portion from this region, and I also used this original image and I cut out like different bits and pieces from here, and I stitched it all together and I put everything into this group. And after that it will look something like this. And once again, I know it looks a bit weird now. The colors are a bit off, and the reason why the colors are a bit off is because I disabled all the layers at the top, but I will be coming back to them later on. And just like with the clothing, this was another process that took a lot of time. So once I add the shadows and highlights, it will look much better. So that's basically what I did here with the neck. And after that, it was time to add the armbands, which is obviously part of Goku's costume. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. So the armbands, both of them were created from this clothes. I cut out like small pieces of it and I kind of shaped it in this way. And yeah, that was pretty much it with the armbands. Alright, so moving on to the next step, and this was probably the most fun part of this edit. And if you're wondering if there's something missing from this scene, it's obviously the hair. I mean, Goku would not be complete without his hair, right? So for the hair, what I had to do was use some references because I knew it was gonna be very difficult without references. So I used a bunch of references and I made a rough outline of his hair, then I filled it with black and it kinda looks something like this. The hair is now very flat or two-dimensional, but we want to make it three-dimensional. So how do you go about doing that? So the answer is pretty easy. So what I did here is that, let me go and uncheck that first. So I made a rough selection of Benny's hair and I copied it onto a new layer. And if you're wondering what the hell is going on right now, it will make sense in a bit. So I'm gonna go all the way down here to this group and I'm gonna expand it. And I'm gonna come all the way down here, and as you can see, these are individual chunks of hair which I placed on different layers. And so what I did here is that I used this piece of Benny's actual hair and I clipped it to every chunk of hair. So basically every chunk of hair that you see here comes from the exact same piece of hair, and the only difference is in its shape and form. So let me go ahead and do the same for every chunk of hair. And there you go. So now the colors are a bit off, which we will obviously change in a while. And then I went ahead and did the exact same thing for his front hair as well. So there we have it. And for reference, let me move this over here. So this is one of the images that I referenced, and this is the outline that I created. It is slightly different but looks like anime hair nonetheless, at least I hope. And that is it with the hair for now. Okay, so now that we're done with the hair, let's add some rocks in the background. So these rocks were created from this image, and I cut out individual pieces of rocks and I then placed it in these areas to make it seem as if they were flying away. And similarly, using the exact same image, I added some rocks in front of him as well, and I also applied a motion blur on them, just to give the image some motion as well as some depth of field. So yeah, that's basically the composition done. And now it's time for the shadows, highlights, lighting, special effects, all that kind of stuff. So let's get to that. So for the special effects, I decided to go with this image because I wanted to turn this into Super Saiyan Blue. And pretty much what I did here is that I turned this layer blend mode to screen, and then I used different editing techniques like puppet warp to turn this image into this. So let me go down here and make this visible again. So there you go. So that's basically what I did here with the effects on his body. And in order to bring in some atmospheric depth to the image, I sampled some colors from this image, and by using a fog brush with a very low flow, I started painting in some fog in the foreground as well as in the background. So I'm gonna make this layer visible again, and you can see that as soon as I start adding the fog, it kind of gives a pretty nice atmospheric depth to the image. And finally, it's time to add some shadows and highlights and also some lighting as well. So first up, I'm gonna start with the upper clothes. So let me go ahead and expand this layer. So the first thing that I added is an exposure layer, and then I reduced the exposure, after which I painted in some shadows as well as highlights by using a soft rounded brush. And in order to change the colors a little bit, I added a few hue saturation adjustment layers, and I also painted in some shadows as well as highlights in a few more layers on top as well. And once that was done, it would look something like this. And now I'm gonna go to this group, the lower clothes, and I'm gonna do the exact same thing here as well. And if you are wondering why I'm using a lot of layers, I would tell you that there is no specific reason behind it. I could use a lot less layers than I normally do, but at this point I just feel like it's a force of habit. So anyway, that is it with the shadows and highlights on the clothes. Alright, so now that we're done with the clothes, the next step is to change the exposure of the skin, because the skin doesn't match the environment, nor does it match the clothing that he's wearing. And also the skin is a bit too warm as well. So we want to change that from a warm tone to a cool tone. So I'm gonna go here into this group, and one by one I'm gonna make all these layers visible. And you can see how the skin tones, the highlights as well as the shadows change as I do this. And like I said before, don't get intimidated by the number of layers I'm using. Sometimes I don't even know how I end up with that many layers. But anyways, that's basically what I did here with the arms. So now you can clearly see that the tone has shifted from a warm tone to a cool tone. And yeah, we are done here. So now moving on to the next part. And similar to what I've done here with the arms, so I'm gonna do that with the neck as well. So I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna expand it. And then I'm gonna start adding the layers one by one, just like we did before. Okay, so there we go. And now that we are done with the neck part, I'm gonna change the exposure of the face as well. But before that, let's change the color of his hair, because obviously if I'm turning this into Super Saiyan blue, we need to get some blue color in the hair, right? So I'm gonna go over here into the hair group, and I'm gonna add some adjustment layers to completely change the outlook of this hair. So the key adjustment layer here is definitely the hue saturation adjustment layer, because that is the one that I used to change the color of his hair. And the other adjustment layers were used to create the shadows as well as the highlights. So now I'm gonna add these layers one by one. And now I'm gonna do that for the front hair as well. So there we have it. The hair looks a bit plain right now, and that's because I haven't added any shadows and highlights to the face. So that's what I'm gonna do now. So I'm gonna go here to the base layer, and you know what, actually before that, I'm gonna get rid of these unnecessary bits from the hoodie that's popping out from here and there. So I'm gonna click on this layer mask, and boom, there we go. And now we're gonna add the adjustment layers. So the adjustment layers that I've used here on the face are very similar to the ones that I used here on the arms as well as the neck. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And there we go. And I feel like it's all coming together now, right? And with that being said, we are almost done with the foreground. And then I looked at the background, but it seemed a bit too bright than the foreground. So I felt like I had to reduce the exposure of it. So that's what I did here on this layer. So I reduced the exposure quite a bit, and I also changed the gamma correction as well. And after that, to make the colors pop, I went to the base layer yet again, and I then added an outer glow around Benny all the way through. And I used a very similar shade of blue that I use here with the energy waves. And there we have it. It looks much better now, right? And then I added a few strands of hair in the back over here on either sides. And just like what I did here with this image, I used the exact same image to kind of create an effect over here as well with the rocks. And then I went to this group over here, and as you can see, the rocks are a bit too overexposed and the colors don't quite match the environment. So I added some adjustment layers to change the color and exposure of these rocks. So I'm gonna make these layers visible again, and you can see the colors changing. And there we go. And I did the same thing over here with this rock as well. And that is it with the rocks. And after that, I went ahead and did the exact same thing for the rocks in the foreground as well. So I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna make these layers visible again. And at this point I thought to myself, well, the image looked pretty decent, but it was still lacking something, and that something was atmospheric depth. So I went ahead and added a few layers of fog right on top, and as I add them you can see that it makes a lot of difference. Now have a look at that. And I guess it's true, a little bit of fog, it just makes up for everything. And once I added the fog, I thought that the background looked a bit bland. So I went all the way down here and I added a bunch of hue saturation adjustment layers to match the color of the foreground with the background. And there you go. And after that I changed the color of the eyes by painting a bit of blue over the eyes using color dodge as the blending mode. And I also added some extra details on the face as well. And finally I made a few more adjustments and the image went straight into camera raw filter. And there I did some more fine tuning, and I did not expect this video to be this long, but here we are at the end and this is the final image.